Yeah, well, let's just kick off, and first of all, let's just introduce the topic as I just did briefly, and perhaps some of you didn't know what I was talking about, but I'll come back to that. First of all, just the introduction to this topic is that there's the EU regulation that hit us all, or is gonna hit us all by next January, is what drives most of the attention with our clients these days. But let's just zoom out and say that we've been following the legislation and the regulation of the ESG for a long time by now, especially with our focus, which is in the IT industry. But of course, it affects much more than the IT industry. But again, our focus will be from the point of IT. However, that doesn't make it irrelevant for other industries, and a lot of our points goes for all industries. But today the focus, as always, will be IT and how it affects the IT market. But we've been following this legislation closely, and the latest CSRD protocol has some implications for you as a client or as a vendor, and that's some of the things we want to talk about today. The CSRD protocol requires companies to report your carbon emissions and other things. We'll be again focusing on the carbon emissions specifically, and just mentioning some of the other ESG requirements and areas of focus. But what happened with the CSRD coming into effect here in 1st of January is that everyone has to report your carbon emissions. Everyone has to set targets of your carbon emissions, especially large firms, but it also affects smaller firms via the supply chain requirements that's also included in this legislation. So if you're not affected directly by the CSRD protocol, you will probably be it indirectly. And because from 2025, all large firms are required to report this, the carbon emissions, and to do that for their supply chain, they need to collect the carbon emissions from their suppliers, and therefore you need to start collecting data so you'll be able to report by 2025. Moreover, there's a lot of other reasons than just the compliance with the CSRD protocol. There's a lot of reasons to pay attention to either the ESG area. One is the news that I started with before some of you got in, that the global carbon footprint is still increasing year by year, and last year we saw a 1% increase globally. Of course, that's less than that's a slower increase than that we've seen for some other years. But there's also it's not just green initiatives that's driving this slowdown of the carbon footprint. It's just as much the slowdown of the economy in certain areas. Europe as one example. So that's why we're going to talk about ESG today. We hope to get into how it affects you very much in detail, because the calculations behind all of this is also something that can be difficult to understand. But we'll take you through much of the methodology, and we'll take you through just some brief introduction to the legislation that came into effect, and then we'll see how it in practice this will affect your everyday. So perhaps you should take us through the agenda and then we'll kick it off?
Yeah, so as Dan said, we'll start out by going through sort of the basics of carbon emission in data centers. Much of the EU legislation regarding IT is obviously based around the data centers, so we'll talk you through how to measure your carbon emissions in the data center and from what part of the data center is most of the emission, does most of the emission come from. Then we'll go through how you can include ESG in the contracts with your vendors, as well as how can you set some targets which has the goal to reduce carbon emission. In that part we will go through both how can you set an ambitious target, we will touch upon the science-based targets, and in the end we will use a few minutes to discuss how you can reveal your actual carbon footprint, because in reality the CSRD regulation will not reveal your footprint, and being compliant with CSRD is not what will tell you how much carbon how large your carbon emission is.
Yeah, and there's a lot of reason to start documenting your green initiatives, or just to start calculating, so you can use the calculation as a guideline for choosing one over the other, more than just the normal quality and price of each initiative. Yes, but time's flying, and again, if anyone has a question, anyone has something that you feel we should discuss, feel free, raise your hand or interrupt us. We have a lot of things that we're not going to cover, and we can cover more than this. So, but first of all, the basics of calculating carbon emissions and specifically in data center operations. Of course, this is related to other IT as well, and much of the calculations is directly transferable to whatever carbon footprint it is that you want to calculate. But here it's from the point of view from a data center. So what makes up the carbon footprint? Well, it's a pretty simple calculation in the end, but of course there's a lot of rules and definitions around how you can calculate this, and the devil's in the detail, as you say, and especially around this area where greenwashing and other different accounting methods can make it very difficult for people that are not very much into the calculations to distinguish between a green initiative and a not so green initiative. What we follow, our calculation methods and a lot of the professional both customers and consultants and also vendors follow the GHG protocol that sets out some greenhouse gas accounting standards. It talks about what you should include and how you should include it in the calculations. There's some quality criteria that all contractual instruments must meet for the data source to be valid, and there's a lot of definitions on what you can and cannot include and why you should as well. But it's a freely available guide, and it's not rocket science to say it like that. It's readable for us all. And it basically talks about how you can disclose this carbon footprint in a transparent and professional manner. So there's a link here, and you can find it in when you receive the slides, and then you can read up on this. The picture here is only on the Scope 2 guidance, and there's of course a Scope 1 and a Scope 3 as well. But we'll get back to that.
Yeah, so the greenhouse gas protocol sets out 3 scopes of carbon emissions, and we'll get back later to which one is the most relevant for the data center. But going through them, the scope 1 is the direct emissions from company activities. This could be the company vehicles, which obviously has a carbon emission from gas. This could be the factories used to produce the goods which your company is selling. Then there is a scope 2, which is the purchased electricity and the purchased heating and cooling. And this is, we'll get back to, as I said, but this is something which is very relevant for a data center, as much of the equipment will be using a lot of electricity while in operation. And then there's the third scope, which is emissions which are not controlled directly by your company, and this will be the production and transportation of the hardware you use, and this will be the commute used by your employers when they get to work.
Yeah, so that's your supply chain, basically, what you purchase. Yeah,
exactly. So, as you should be able to see on this slide, we have brought an example of how companies in different sectors are mostly have the largest part of their carbon emission from different scopes. As you see in retail, much of the emission is not directly controlled by the company. As Dan said, it's mostly from the supply chain of all the goods that the retail stores are selling. Then in shipping, this is heavily reliant on the company vehicles. This could be a large ship or the trucks which are transporting the goods from one country to another, or from production to store. Then the largest part of the emission will come from scope 1. And then finally, we have a data center where 88%, as an example, of carbon emissions come from scope 2, which is the power used, the electricity used by the servers, etc., in the data center, as well as the electricity used for the cooling system. So what this shows is that there are severe differences across sectors and across companies on which part or which scope of carbon emission is mostly relevant when trying to document and trying to reduce carbon emissions.
Yes, and in the reporting light, there's different requirements of what you report in the if it's scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And some of the scope 3 might not be included in companies' ESG reporting. And if you're purchasing from a vendor, they might not report their scope 3 emissions. It's relevant to look at which scopes are included when you are looking at accounting of carbon emissions from anyone you're dealing with. But there's a good reason to look at these different scopes, as you can see here, because it varies a lot from what sector you're in, what is your key driver in your carbon footprint. And for the data center, it's the purchased electricity or energy, as in power or cooling, and that's the key factor here. And that's also the focus. The scope 2 is the main focus of our presentation today.
Yes, so we have brought here some examples of the lifetime carbon emission of some enterprise servers. And what you can see is that almost all of the carbon emission from a server is while it comes from when the server is in use. That is the manufacturing and the transport and the end of life carbon emissions do not account for a large share of the emission, but while in use, that is 84% for the left one and 96% for the right one. These are the shares which come from in use. And when the server is in use, the emission comes from primarily from the electricity use. What this also tells us is that when you are operating a data center and you want to reduce your emissions, you should primarily focus on the electricity use when operating the servers and the data center, and perhaps less on the other parts, which is what we also discussed before.
And of course, this is different for each hardware type, but specifically for server, this is the general picture. Of course, again, the details here are also important, and depending on what type of energy you're using, the blue operational part of the carbon footprint will change. If you're in a country that produces a lot of green electricity, the share of the total lifetime CO2 emission will be larger for the manufacturing, of course, because just by reducing the carbon emissions from your operational CO2 emissions. So again, we don't have to dive into all the details each time, but it's just saying that these numbers are general, and it always comes down to the specific case, what the exact numbers are, and pay attention to the details, because it's not straightforward to calculate, and it's very easy to hide behind some great statistics that might have been made in a way that could be called greenwashing, and we see that a lot. Of course, most of the players on the market here tell the story in the most green way that they can, but if you can read through it, it might not be that green. One example is Microsoft, that has that are very good at communicating how green their operations are, but again, we'll come back to that, and that depends a lot on if you're looking at their electricity consumption in a market-based approach or the location-based approach, because that will give you completely different numbers. And of course, they are, or not of course, but they could communicate otherwise, but they're communicating what their CO2 emissions are in a market-based approach, which is one way to calculate it. There's another one which will have a different impact, and we'll come back to that just in a second, exactly now. And that, and just to take that one step back again, there are two ways of calculating your Scope 2 carbon emissions: the location-based and the market-based approach. The location-based is what is using your actual electricity consumption, and then looking at the location it's consumed in, and how green the production of electricity was in that area. So the grid that you're connected to, or your data center is connected to, how much renewable energy is in that grid, and how much is non-renewable. In our example on the left here, it's 40% renewable, a mix of 40% renewable and 60% non-renewable. So when you spend one gigawatt hour, 40% of that is green energy and 60% is not. So your carbon emissions will be the amount consumed of energy, but where 60% of that has a carbon emission. On the other hand, if you calculate it in a market-based approach, and you have bought what we call RECs, these renewable energy certificates, which is a way to offset your carbon emissions, it's an instrument where you are guaranteed a certain amount of green energy. and there's nothing wrong with that in itself. It's just it doesn't really change the overall pollution that is in the grid. So let's say if you are purchasing renewable energy certificates for all of your consumed energy, well then in the market-based approach you can say we have no carbon emissions from our electricity consumption. On the other hand, the location-based approach would say, well, you still have the exact same as anyone else in this grid because you consume that much electricity, and we polluted that much by producing this electricity all in all. On the market-based approach, you can say no, my energy consumption was purely green, but that goes into the accounting, but the problem with this approach is that the rest of the grid still has the exact same amount of black energy, and I'll just try to minimize us here so you can see. So in this very stylized example, there's less renewable. There's only 39% renewable left for everyone else, and then there's a greater share of non-renewable, being 61% here. So it doesn't change that you've purchased this certificate. Doesn't change the production of energy in the location. That could be Denmark or Holland or whatever. But in your accounting, you can say you have no carbon emission, and the rest will have to say that they have the same. Or they will use the location-based approach, saying that 40% was renewable and 60% was not. So what we're saying here is that it doesn't change the overall pollution that you are buying these offsetting certificates. It just in the market-based approach you can document it as zero carbon emissions. The normal way to go around this is that large clients would larger organizations, normally they will report both of these because there's nothing wrong in the market-based approach. It's just saying something different than the location-based approach is. Because you're consuming energy in Denmark, there's still pollution from energy production in Denmark, and because of that there's carbon emissions each year. The market-based approach is just saying that you are somewhat incentivizing the production of green energy because you've purchased this certificate at a certain price, and that price is an investment that's a financing of the green energy production. So you are pushing the green agenda. You're just not polluting, you can say.
Yes, and this is also because if many companies want to buy these renewable energy certificates, these will increase in price, which will incentivize a larger production of green energy, and also increase the business case of actually producing green energy because the alternative is more expensive.
Exactly. Yeah. So they're both. There's nothing wrong with either of these. It's just they're showing different versions. And you have to pay attention to this, because if you think you are reading a location-based accounting and you're actually looking at a market-based approach, well, then you might be thinking that, wow, great, they're not polluting at all here because they say there's zero pollution or zero carbon emissions from the energy production or the energy consumption, but that's not the case. And a little side note on this is also there's a great variation in the quality of these certificates, and I'm not expecting you to dive much into that, but just there are certain ways that these certificates are being validated, and not all of them have the same standards. So just be aware that this could be an area of concern if you're just trusting these in a blind manner. But maybe you should take this.
Yeah. So we have also we have discussed sort of the carbon emission from the data center is from the electricity, but to calculate the number of CO2 which your data center is emitting, you should take the power consumption and multiply by the emission intensity. And as Dan said, you can measure this in a few ways, but this is the way to calculate the scope 2 emissions of your data center.
Yeah, and here it's exactly the emission intensity that is two different numbers if you use the market-based approach or the location-based approach, at least if you have purchased or your vendor has purchased green certificates.
And the emission intensity is very different. We will get back to that, but it is very different in different countries. And this is also something you can take into account when if you have a decision on where to outsource to or where to build a data center and these things. So.
Yeah, but it's a simple equation. How much power have you consumed, and where was it produced? Because the emission intensity is different from location to location and different from year to year. We'll get back to it, but with those two numbers, you have your CO2 emissions from the data center, whatever it is you've consumed power on, and let's come up with examples in a second.
Yes, so what you can say is that the power consumption of your data center is made up of two types of electrical power. It is made up by the data center facility and the data center hardware. So the first part is sort of the cooling and the lighting of the data center, and the second part is how much power is the actual hardware which is installed in your data center using. This can be the servers, the storage units, the network components, everything which you have installed in the data center.
Yeah, and of course this is also when you're purchasing a YAS system, or all the applications that are based on some data center somewhere. Of course, this is applicable for that. Now we're just talking about it as in one data center, but of course it goes for workloads and different types of measures from an IT perspective in a data center. But each of these we will just touch upon.
So the first thing is the power usage effectiveness of your data center. So this is basically saying what is the total facility power usage divided by what is the total hardware power usage. So what this is basically saying is what is the overhead from operating the data center in addition to operating the hardware itself. So we have taken some examples here where you see that in the best practice case, there is a 10% overhead in power usage, whereas as an internal setup compared to the best practice may be almost the overhead of 30%. So this is obviously the more power your data center uses in addition to the power used by the hardware, the less effective it will be and the larger the carbon emission from your data center will be.
Yes, and the power efficiency of data centers is of course something that at least the large vendors spend a lot of time on designing and optimizing, and it's a moving target. So these numbers will probably be decreasing as technology evolves and as data centers are modernized and optimized based on the effectiveness, because energy is a large cost for a data center operator, and it's only in their interest as well to minimize this, because in that way they'll be more competitive against others. But we see very varying PUEs when we ask and measure this, and it's also affected by where's the data center located. If it's in a cold climate, it doesn't use as much energy to cool it down. If it's in Singapore, for example, these numbers will be much higher. So these are examples from Northern Europe, as you can see. But it's an easy way to regard your energy and your carbon emission cost of the chosen data center. It's the premium of that data center. And the hyperscaler best practice as you have here is some of the newest hyperscaler data centers that are designed with all the latest technology and best thoughts going into this. And in that way, they're minimizing their overhead electricity because it makes sense for them as a cost, but also as a carbon emission. That was the PUE. Then there's the data center hardware, the other side here.
Yeah, so obviously the main part of the power consumption will come from the hardware which is installed. The hardware requires power in order to run. And this is you can see we have brought some examples. So what you will do here is you will measure how much power does each of the units you have installed in your data center use. This, together with the PUE of the data center, will then tell you exactly how much power your entire data center is using, which is then to be multiplied by the carbon emission and finally provide us with the total carbon, multiplied with the emission intensity, which will provide us with the total carbon emission of your data center. What you will see is that the newer servers will be more power efficient, and this is, as Dan said, this is both good for the CO2 agenda, but it's also a cost-saving effort because power is expensive, especially in recent years. We have brought a stylized example from, not stylized example, but an example. This is a bit of an old figure, but the point stands that the power consumption per gigabyte of a storage unit here is severely decreasing over time, which obviously is good for cost saving, but it's also good for the carbon emission, as the total emissions from the data center will be much lower.
Yeah, and this is just these are old numbers, but it's the same trend we still see, that the newer hardware is optimized much more regarding power consumption. And as they grow in capacity, the unit, the power consumption per capacity is decreasing. But as you can see here, it's not small decreases. It's vast decreases. As the example from the 3-par to the G400 is a 94% reduction in your power consumption per gigabyte storage. And that has continued, and we have some other figures later that shows the trend of more energy efficient hardware. And that's just one argument of life cycling your hardware in a professional manner, because your electricity bill will be lower. Also because your capacity is probably growing at a high rate. So will your power consumption if you don't use more efficient hardware. We'll get back to some more examples of this. But just saying that from that you get a lot of green points.
Yes, so then obviously the other part is the emission intensity. This tells you how much CO2 is generated from divided by how much power is used. And as you can see, there are very large differences across countries, even within just Europe, where as are multiple 100% differences between just Norway and then the Czech Republic, which is one of the worst performing ones in Europe. And this is also very important, as I said previously, to note when making decisions on where to place your data center or where to choose an outsourcing partner, and so on. Obviously, you can see on the bottom right that the efficiency is somewhat increasing over time, although there's been a slight increase in the carbon emissions average in recent years.
Yeah, so the EU average is basically all of the ones above into how much CO2 is emitted per watt hour in EU produced. And yeah, there's a lot of explanation behind this, but overall there was and probably still is a trend of more of greener energy production in Europe. The increase of the latest 2 years is pretty much because of the Ukraine conflict and the boycott of Russian gas, which has made some of the energy production based on coal instead. So hopefully that will return to the former trend where this will keep decreasing. So the electricity of entire EU is greener by each year. But to Mads' point, it's very it depends, or it has a large effect if you can choose between different countries when choosing where to locate your data center. And of course, that's not a given for a lot of your decisions, but when it comes to the cloud, you can choose exactly where you want to put your data center workloads, and when you think about that, you should at least if you want to reduce your CO2 emissions, consider which area are you actually choosing, where much of Microsoft's data centers are in the Netherlands or in Ireland. If you can choose a Danish data center or a Swedish data center or a Norwegian data center, you will reduce that CO2 emission by 50% or even more, right? And that's an easy way to reduce your data center carbon emissions. And on that note, just be aware that the Azure CO2 calculator is doing this on a market-based approach, so it won't tell you that you're polluting more by choosing the Netherlands over Denmark. And there's a lot of reason for that, but to be true to your CO2 to your accounting, you should regard the different locations' emission intensities. Yes, so the location has a lot to say, but of course it's not that you can move your data center, local data center, just because of this. But when you can choose between different locations, think of the emission intensities, because that's also an effect of your choice. So going more into the measurement and how do we get these data, because now we just talked about how you calculate it. Just briefly, as time is moving, just briefly on the data center power consumption data. The main point in this is that this data is ready available. The data center power consumption is something that you're actually measuring already, or your vendor is measuring already, because they are very much aware that this is one of their main costs. So you can, if you have a hosting partner, you can probably get your power consumption in the monthly invoices, and you can also check on your purchased hardware what the technical specifications are and how much power consumption it normally uses. In the new legislation, there are some requirements to these technical specifications and the power consumptions of each hardware component, also servers, and we'll get back to that in a second. But just saying here that the data on how much power consumption there is readily available, and a lot of the data centers are monitoring this in a live manner, so they have rack measurements or PDUs on different racks where they can see the power consumption on a live manner, and they are recording it so they can see how much your servers consumed over a certain period. So that's the power consumption of the hardware. The PUE, that was the direct power. The indirect power, the PUE, you can just ask for, and if it's your own data center, you can calculate it by looking at your total power consumption against how much was the hardware consumption, and the residual there would be your overhead, of course. And then there's the global emission intensities, as we just showed you before with Belgium and Norway and those examples. These are publicly available. They are published in Denmark by Energinet, and there's also the AIB that publishes these for the European countries, and the IAE are publishing this for global regions. A lot of countries are included there. So when looking at the emission intensities, you can just look this up in publicly available data. So the EU regulation.
Yeah, so now we'll take you to, in short, the new EU regulation and what types of the regulation it is actually demanding of you, and how do these reporting demands look in practice. So the CSRD is a part of sort of a larger promotion by the EU towards a more sustainable private sector, and this requires you to document your sustainability initiatives starting in 2025. And as you can see, we have sort of made this timeline showing what is the activity these firms who should report from 2025 need to be doing at a certain time. As now we are in 2024, what's important is that you are already collecting the data necessary to be reporting from next year, because this may be something that you are not previously monitoring, but this is actually demanded to you by EU law from next year.
And as we said, it's starting with the large firms, but because there's also this Scope 3 requirement, they will have to report their supply chains carbon emissions as well by next January, and because of that, they are already. It's not that it hasn't happened. They are already requiring smaller or larger vendors to report this, how much was their purchased carbon emission. And this is an area that has moved fast. We've seen a lot of we've discussed this with a lot of clients and vendors over the last year or a bit more, because everyone was a bit caught off guard here that already by 2024 you should start collecting on these things that a lot of organizations were not measuring beforehand. So, and there are various ways to be compliant with the CSRD because there's different approaches to how to calculate your carbon footprint, and one way that we see most of firms coping with the compliance issue is using this revenue-based approach, which we haven't spent and are not going to spend too much time on here, because it's basically a very inaccurate way of measuring your CO2 footprint, but it's a method that is easily applicable, and it's easily implemented in your green accounting. So for some it's a first step to start documenting their CO2 footprint, but in the end it's not the way to go, as it will not give you any points for green initiatives or for choosing a greener vendor, because it's based on industry averages rather than the actual carbon footprint of your perhaps very green vendor.
So if we take sort of a general look at the CSRD, it sets requirements to firms within all parts of the ESG agenda. So there are both some general requirements, and then there are within the environmental and the social and the governance tracks, so to speak. What you can see is that the environmental agenda relates to climate, pollution, and stuff like resource use, and then there are the social ones, which has to do with your workforce and the value chain, and then there are the business conduct in the governance track. What we will focus on is within the environmental part of this, as the reporting domains related to IT and the data center is centered around what you can see called the E1 and E5, which relates to the climate and the resource use. The CSRD sets concrete requirements to stuff like these measures that you see on the top right here, the server active state efficiency, the PUE, as we have discussed previously, and then the renewable energy factor, which we will come back to in a few minutes. Then with relation to E5, this has to do with stuff like how do you manage your end-of-life equipment, and is this handled in a sustainable manner.
But yes, as here we have the first mention of the GPP requirements, and there's to make this easier. Of course, the EU has defined some standards around power usage and server efficiency, and some of these are made for you to just rely on. As long as the number of this is higher than this, then this is green enough, and the EU sets the requirements for that. And we've seen the EU do this with a lot of things, and this is in my opinion one of the ways that EU is doing a great job, because it sets a bottom standard of various things, and by that pushing some of the older technologies out of the EU consumption. But again, this is only the bottom that they are moving. It's not the very ambitious targets that are here, because it's minimum requirements just to be able to sell it in the EU market. And of course that's great. Just pay attention that these requirements are not very ambitious. It's basically
so it's an effective way for the EU to start companies in the journey towards measuring all of its carbon emission and being able to document the exact carbon emissions from its operations, but it's not something which brings companies very close to reaching the general goals of the Paris Agreement and so on.
we're going to elaborate on that now in the various areas. First of all, taking a look at the CSRD, the demands for a server hardware efficiency. These are some new requirements and a new way to measure server hardware power efficiency. As you can see, this is very small, but there are two levels of the criteria. There's a compliance, and then there's a more comprehensive criteria, which is basically two different numbers of the same measure. So it could be, and it's very small, but the compliance criteria for one type of server, this is a one-socket rack server, would be a minimum efficiency score of 11.0. The more comprehensive criteria is a 13.0 score for the same type of server. What's behind the number 11 or 13 is a bit more difficult, and it's a technical measure done on a lab, just like the mileage of a new car would be measured somewhere and then documented, and then saying, well, this is how green this car is. This is the same thing that's going on with the server hardware. But taking it just a step deeper, it's basically 9 different activities or workloads that you test the server on, and then you measure, not you, but then the laboratory measures how much power is consumed doing these different tasks. And from this, they will then score it or give it a CSRD metric in the range of between 0 and, I don't know what the highest score is right now, but perhaps 30. And as you can see, the CPU is the, if I just move my head, the CPU is the biggest driver of this score, and the memory has some in the storage part of a server. It drives 5% of the score. But from those workloads, you get a score, and that's documented alongside the technical specifications of this given types of server. And the EU is now then saying, well, to be on the European market, this number, our servers, depending on what type it is, if it's a socket or 2-socket or a tower or a rack server or a blade server, etc., there's some certain minimum requirements to this score, and they're doing this to eliminate old hardware being sold in EU.
Yeah, and as Dan said, this is a very technical calculation, which for most of you will never find this relevant. But the general principle is that it measures how well is what is the output of the server calculations divided by the power consumption, and therefore saying something about how effective is this server relates to its in relation to its power consumption.
Yeah, and you don't have to measure it yourself. You have these Energy Star in the US, for example, doing these measurements and documenting these. So at least most of the newer servers have this rating, and you can look that up. But at least when you as a procurement function are looking at this, you need to ensure that they are meeting the EU requirements for these servers. But as we will show you in a second, the EU requirements are very low, so we'll be surprised if someone's trying to offer you a server that has a lower score than the minimum requirements. But on the other hand, this is also a way to measure how green the server is. So disregarding the EU criteria, you can also use these scores as an evaluation criteria when comparing different servers or other hardware types with other ratings against each other. So this is a good metric to regard when you're deciding between one or the other type of hardware.
Yes, and we have brought here a bunch of examples of this SERT score relative to when the server was released onto the market. And what's important to note is that there are a lot of factors which go into the score, and it's not entirely clear that for each year they just get more and more effective. However, we do see an upward going trend that they are scoring better and better as time goes on.
Yeah, so just basically what the figure here is showing is different types of servers, but across the types that has different criteria. So, and you have various producers of these of the servers, and you can see how they score. But and with the timeline at the bottom, you can see there's an upward going trend that the newer servers have a higher, the lowest of this example, the 2023 servers, the lowest score of that one is 24, I believe that is. And you can see in the 2018 servers, we have a score of just below 10 in the SERT metric. And these are the, and of course this will continue to be measured, and you can plot your servers into this when regarding or when purchasing new. The good thing is that it's an upward going trend, and the EU is setting a minimum requirement for what is to be sold in the market. And as that minimum requirement will move upwards, so will the life cycling just come by regulation and not just from the optimizing of cost from the vendors. So these are the threshold that the GPP has a standard on. And as you can see, the GPP standard for this type of server here is the one socket rack server type is 11. And all of the things, all of the servers we've brought here are compliant with that issue. So you can actually buy a server produced in 2018 and introduce it in a data center here if you're interested in that. It's just saying that the GPP standard by now is very basic. However, as you can see in the top of our figure here, the forthcoming standard, it's a bit difficult to read that's what it's saying there, but the coming standards would probably, we expect them to be around 27, 26, because that's actually what the standard in the US is by now. That's the US version 4.0. So the minimum requirement is probably going to be moved to that threshold instead of the current at 11 for this type of server. And we'll see this picture for all the other types and all of servers and all the other types of hardwares. And as that moves, the threshold moves, so will the efficiency of all the new servers introduced in EU be. This doesn't say anything about, just a note to that, it doesn't say anything about what you can have located in your data centers. It's fine that you have a very old data center at least in this perspective. You're not, it's not that they're coming to audit your old servers of how efficient they are. It's just when you purchase a new server, it has to live up to these minimum requirements.
Yeah, and as Dan said, the EU regulations are actually directly using the thresholds which are used in the US standard version 3. So we have not seen this yet, but we expect that in the future the US version 4 will also be implemented in the EU. Obviously, the picture is not exactly the same for all types of servers, so this should be considered as an example for the one socket rack servers.
Yes. Yeah, let's move on. So there's some other data center related requirements set out in the GPP, and we've already touched upon the first of these, and that's the PUE. Now the legislation has some requirements to not the minimum acceptable, but to disclose what category your data center or your new purchased data center services are in. And there's a category 1, category 2, and category 3. And the category 1 is the least efficient, it's the worst performing, and the category 3 is the best performing data center when you're regarding the PUE, which was the overhead of electricity, the power usage effectiveness. And we've just used the figure from before with the hyperscaler and in different areas. And as you can see, some of these data centers, the first and the second one from the left, would be classified as category 3 data centers, and the rest of them would be categorized as category 2, and they even, if we had examples of PUEs above 1.5, they would have been categorized as category 3. And what this is an instrument to is basically it's an easy way to set requirements. Of course, you can say, well, we just want you to document what type of data center you are, but you could also use this as an evaluation score, or as a criteria in your tender that you only want category 3 data centers for your purchased services. That's an example, or you could be category 2, or as we recommend, you actually use the PUE as a direct evaluation criteria against each other. And of course, there's a way of documenting your PUE, and there are differences in this, but the overall idea of using this as a competitive evaluation criteria will make you able to choose between greener and not so green data centers in itself, making it a part of the quality criteria in your tenders or negotiations or whatever you are purchasing on. And then the other factor is the REF, the share of renewable electricity. This is a way of saying how much have you purchased or are guaranteed to be green. How much of your purchased electricity is guaranteed to be CO2 free. Coming back to the market-based versus location-based, this is of course, or not of course, but this is in this GPP said to be the market-based way of measuring this. So the requirement of this is of new data centers is actually that they are to be 100% based on renewable electricity, and that is saying that they need to buy certificates because there's not one country in the EU so far that has entirely green energy, but they need to buy the certain amount of certificates to adhere to this requirement of new data centers. And again, this is pushing the agenda of more investments into to green power production, which will in the end give us a greener power production in Europe. Again, you can use this measure as it's defined in the GPP and also easily defined otherwhere or elsewhere. You can use this as a competitive criteria when you're measuring vendors against each other. Just like you could do this on a location-based way, saying what is your emission intensity in the area that your data center is located in. And that's actually a nice way to get into the next topic, the target setting, because so far the EU legislation is more about compliance. There is a mention of everyone should set some targets, but it's very fluffy. You just basically need to have a strategy for your carbon emissions if you are a large firm. But how can you set targets? Because there are compliant targets and there are more ambitious targets as we see it. The compliance is not enough looking at the science-based target initiatives, but it's of course up to your organization to set the target where you find suitable.
And this is also because the CSRD demands that firms are reporting on what initiatives they are taking to improve sustainability and to reduce carbon emissions. So an obvious way of doing this is setting some ambitious targets, which will continuously secure that carbon emissions are lowered as much as possible. Yes, so the first thing is that when you are choosing a target for your carbon emissions is obviously to focus on the overall footprint. And looking at the factors which go into the carbon emissions, we can look at the power usage effectiveness of the data center, we can look at the emission intensity, and we can look at the hardware performance. And the thing is here that we have brought a stylized example to show this, but the thing is that it is not enough to only have extremely effective hardware and an extremely effective data center if this data center is placed in a country or a region where the emission intensity is extremely high, because then the carbon footprint of your company will still be extremely high. So
yeah, the Czech Republic, for example.
Yes.
Yeah.
So going through the examples, you see that there is an example where the PUE is very poor, and there's an example where the location is poor, as I just said, and then there's one where the PUE is very good and the location is placed with very green energy, but as the hardware is not performing well, then the carbon emissions will still be high. In this example, the ambitious target setting should focus on all factors which go into the carbon emission and which will provide the lowest carbon emissions in the end.
Yeah, and of course this is an easy point, but it's an important one that you're not just looking at one of these factors when evaluating different options. Of course, there might be a lot of business cases where the location is the exact same, and you can disregard that and only look at the PUE and the hardware performance. But it's just taking the overall footprint into account is what needs to be done in an ambitious target setting. And it's basically these three things that will affect that in the end. And setting requirements for your vendors or evaluating them against each other can be done when you purchase things, but it can also be done just on internal goal setting or target setting. So, but these are the five factors that we have helped other clients by setting standards and requirements and evaluation criteria within to get a good agreement with a data center or a data center provided to them. And the first of all is the one that the GPP also mentions, the REF, the market-based share of renewable electricity. This is a great measure to see if they are purchasing the certificates or not of that's needed to offset their carbon emissions in that location they are from. Also, you can set a minimum of this, as the GPP is done, saying we're not considering you unless you have a minimum of 100% or 70% or whatever it is. However, note that depending on the location, there might not be a market for this, these guarantees, these guaranteed certificates, especially when you look at the more Asian locations, etc. There might not be certificates enough for your vendor to provide you with 100% renewable electricity in the market-based approach. But in Europe, you could set the target to be 100%, just as the GPP is by now. But again, do it as an evaluation criteria or as a minimum criteria is ways of doing it. Then there's the location-based, which is, at least when you're comparing different locations, or you could be choosing different locations, is a very important one. There is a large difference between choosing Denmark or choosing Holland as your location for your data center, or even going to Norway would reduce from Holland would reduce your carbon footprint by 90-something% just by choosing a different data center. And if the latency and everything else is somewhat the same, well then that could be your that could be why you chose to locate your data center in Norway and not in the Netherlands. Then there's the PUE. You can, as we talked about earlier, you can set minimum criteria here. You can just make them report what type they are or what category they are in these new defined categories, or you can make them make it as an evaluation criteria. And then also, and not least, the degree of reporting and the quality of the reporting on these carbon emissions or other ESG factors is done, and right now is very different from vendor to vendor what they are able to do. Some vendors can do it per application you're running at them, how much CO2 did that spend. Some can only do it per rack, and some will do it as the revenue-based approach, where, as I talked about, where they would just basically say, well, we have a revenue of this many millions per year, and we have a CO2 emission of all of this. So dividing all of our carbon emissions with the revenue, $1 or one kroner would be this much carbon emission. Of course, that won't say anything about whether you chose to do it at a right time. Perhaps your workload was done in the night, where the electricity in general is much greener than at day, and you won't get any credits for that, so to say. So setting requirements, or at least discussing with vendors what they can do on this reporting is an area that I think you should pay a lot of attention to, because this is an area that's moving a lot, and the vendors are manning up on this area and try and they can do much more now than they could half a year ago. And some vendors are way ahead of others. So ask what's available, and also how they can advise you on how to be more green could be a part of the reporting done by your vendor. If they can come up with suggestions how to minimize your carbon emissions from their from what you purchase from them, is something you could ask for. Yes, we have certain formulations of how you could put that into your if it's a tender. We've done this in various tenders, and we can help you if you're uncertain how to formulate it. Of course, it needs to be aligned with the regulation and definitions in that.
Yeah. And I think before we finish up, we will also like to touch upon the science-based targets, which is something which is discussed a lot in recent years. And this is a way of setting targets which align with the Paris Agreement, which obviously has a goal of reducing carbon emissions by a certain amount before 2030. And what the science-based targets does is that it considers Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and based on your current situation, it tells you how much you need to reduce carbon emissions by a certain year. We will show you a table with an example in a minute, but basically you choose a baseline year, which is the most recent year you have data readily available, and then the science-based targets will tell you exactly how much you need to reduce your carbon emissions by a certain year. What's important to note is that this is obviously independent from the regulation, so still only related to the target setting and not the compliance part. We'll get back to also if we believe that this is ambitious goals, but what you can see is that if we move one slide further, is that basically if a company had a base year of 2018, then you can see the exact target.
And when you say base year, you mean if they had a measure of their CO2 carbon emission in a certain year, that would be the base year, right?
Yeah, exactly. So what you can see is that the base year is 2018. Then for each year, from 5 years from the base year, there will be a target on what should the carbon emission then be in that year up until 2030. And there's obviously, when considering the ambitious target setting, there's a bit of an issue in that the early front runners of the green transition are not really rewarded for the gains that they made previously to their base year.
Yeah, so if you were very green at your base year and you were ahead of all your peers, you still have to reduce it by the same amount or the same percentage as anyone else, which doesn't really give you any credit for being earlier green.
And if you are doing very bad on the carbon emission in your base year, then you can actually be compliant with these targets without really reaching a point in which you should be considered green, so to speak.
But that's perhaps just us being very detail-oriented. Of course, this is a great way of saying how will we live up to the science-based targets if we are a data center. How much should we aim for to reduce by each of these years, as you can see, and it's quite large. You can see if your base year is 2018, you should have reduced your carbon emissions by more than 50% in 2030. To adhere to the Paris Agreement, which is a way to minimize the temperature increase in the world, and in that sense avoid much of the feared climate crisis. So this is, of course, as we said, there are some problems with this approach, but this is a way of being ambitious, just to click into these tables or these targets that are already set in this way.
And this is obviously because living up to the science-based targets will guarantee that you are actually improving year by year and being strongly improved when you reach the year 2030.
Yes. And just saying, we of course understand that there's reasons for being just focused on compliance, but there's also reasons for some organizations to be the more ambitious ones or the most ambitious ones, and all of that talks into whether you want to adhere to this science-based targets or go even further. Of course, there's more. You can be even more ambitious than these, but this is way more than being compliant. This is being compliant with the science-based targets and the Paris Agreement, which a lot of companies have said that they have signed up to. But another way of ensuring an ambitious target, and which is very much how we also measure the performance of a contract in the cost area is measuring against your the market. What is the standard of the market today? What is the cheapest price or the best price we've seen for gigabyte storage in the market today? Well, that's the benchmark when we cost benchmark a contract. In the same way, you can benchmark your CO2 emissions against the market. But your ambition doesn't have to be that we need to be the best performing in the market. It could also be that you want to be in the top 50% of the market. You want to be in the better half of the CO2 emissions per gigabyte or whatever it is. This is an easy way of being ambitious or saying where our ambitions lie. Perhaps you just want to be higher than the first 10% because that's enough for you. You don't want to be the worst performer in your industry or in Denmark or whichever way you want to set this. This is an easy way to formulate from a strategic point of view your targets. And then you can compare it to others by asking us or anyone or someone else who has some benchmark data on this to see where is the market today? How green are we compared to that? This is a very flexible market, a flexible way of measuring it, and this is very easy to administrate. And you can do whatever individual goals in this way. We've seen a lot of contracts starting to formulate this as a measure of your targets, rather than being strictly to the science-based targets or on a certain amount of carbon emission in a certain year. This is the way of keeping up with the market at all time. So that's a recommendation from our point, saying do use relative targets if you wanna ensure your ambitions are aligned all the time with anyone else. Lastly, just the last point, as we only have 5 minutes left, is that documenting your footprint or your green initiatives will not come just from this new regulation. There's a lot of initiatives that you are doing that you could be documenting how much you're improving your footprint, or just when you're considering certain options, what will that do to your carbon footprint? To choose the greener option in these bigger questions, well, you need to calculate the impact from scenario A versus scenario B. And we have an old example here of how this is done, and the key point here is that it's difficult to isolate each of the effects of one initiative, because there's almost always a lot of effects going on, and to isolate the effect of your initiative or your past 4 years is a great way to document what you've been doing and how much you've improved, but also a method to evaluate options against each other. And I'll just quickly take us through, or somewhat quickly take us through this graph, which comes from an old client case where we were asked, first of all in 2017, to document how much carbon did a data center emit per year for a client. And that was in 2017. This data center emitted 483 tons of CO2. Then they asked us to come back 3 years later and evaluate the initiatives they had done in the meanwhile, to say how much have they reduced their carbon footprint and which of these initiatives were the most effective ones. And as you can see, first of all, because the emission intensity of Denmark, this was a data center in Denmark, had fallen between 2017 and 2020, if they had done nothing and the exact same data center was there again in 2020, their CO2 emission would have been decreased by 31% purely because Denmark was producing greener energy in 2020 than they did in 2017. So that's not, you couldn't really account, the client couldn't take credit for that reduction. That had nothing to do with their initiatives. So what we wanted to do is compare to the would-be carbon footprint to the actual carbon footprint in 2020. And a few things had happened in the meantime there. And first of all, they had done something that made their the carbon footprint less green and more black here. The 56 tons of higher emission came from them moving from the data center, which was on premise, to a cloud data center located in, I believe it was the Netherlands. And because the Netherlands has a higher emission intensity than Denmark, this migration of some of the workloads increased the carbon footprint for some of it. However, they didn't they didn't migrate all of the workloads to the cloud. Some of it was moved to a new data center, another location in Denmark. And because of this, this other data center had a better PUE, an increased facility efficiency. They reduced the carbon footprint by 22 tons annually. And that's because, better technology and better design of the data center just gave them this reduction. But the most effective thing they had done was that they had switched much of the old hardware, they have life-cycled the old hardware into new hardware, and the increased hardware efficiency from this gave them a reduction annually of 175 tons CO2, which was the main driver of them having a much less 42% greener data center in 2020 than they had in 2017. And that was because of the cloud and the higher PUE and the increased hardware efficiency. Of course, one thing that just mentioned here, that was if you look at the exact same capacity. In the meantime, they had also grown the capacity by a certain amount, which made their actual carbon footprint being much higher, but still being 42% less than it had been if they hadn't moved out of the old data center. So that's just one way of documenting it, and they could use this internally, but also externally in saying, see, we are doing a lot of things to minimize our carbon footprint. IT part of our organization is contributing to our green journey towards less carbon emission. I think that was, sorry, now we ran out of time. It's a lot of small points here. Thank you for your time. Hope the topic was interesting and we gave you some new insights. We have a lot of knowledge on this area, so feel free if there's something that we didn't clarify to reach out.